From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. This episode of Blue Sky covers several topics of interest to us here at the Optimism Institute. First off, we're supportive of efforts to close some of the divides we see in our society. We also believe in investing in our youth, the optimists of tomorrow, and to that end are keen on getting kids off their screens and into the outdoors. Our guest today, Don Carpenter, is a leader in helping kids in rural settings get the same educational benefits and experiences as their peers in more urban and often more affluent settings. Don is the executive director of the Rural Futures Fund, a philanthropic foundation dedicated to addressing the Aspirations challenge in rural communities through long-term investment in the youth of rural Maine. Here he created the Aspirations Incubator, a youth development initiative that fosters problem-solving, creativity, and critical thinking by immersing participants in dynamic learning environments to discover effective prevention and intervention strategies with young people. Don has 35 years of experience in youth development and senior management. As you'll soon hear, he has an engaging and optimistic personality, and he's been at the forefront of social enterprise, developing impactful projects, organizations, and community-based strategies that empower young people to thrive. Believing that programs, institutions, and companies don't change lives, but the relationships within them do, Don has dedicated his life to building connections through innovative student-centered youth development organizations. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Don Carpenter as much as I did. Don Carpenter, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Happy to be here, Bill.
I'm so honored to have you on. You're doing great work that I'd love to share with our audience. And you are described on your website as a visionary and cause-driven leader with an engaging and optimistic personality. You could apply your optimism to all kinds of pursuits. Why rural Maine? Why kids?
Well, that's a great question. I have dedicated my life to the pursuit of raising the aspirations of young people wherever I've lived. But I was so fortunate to be able to show up to Midcoast, Maine through an invitation that my uncle gave me to come and run a trip for kids in the outdoors. And I just knew at the end of it, I was going to stay.
And was that Trekkers, or did that become Trekkers, or is that separate?
That became what is now known as the Trekkers 6-year youth development mentoring model.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about that model, and then we'll talk about what you've evolved into doing now.
Yeah, so the idea was pretty simple. How do we connect caring adults in any given rural community with young people, a relationship in a neutral place in the outdoors? And we live in this beautiful area. And we felt like instead of doing a typical match, like mentoring match one-on-one, what if we could take a cohort of students in a particular grade, in this case, 7th, expose them to the natural world where both the adult and the young person is vulnerable because of whatever conditions might show up, and help them rely on one another in these formidable stages of adolescence. And then not just do it once, not twice, not 3 times, but follow them for 6 years. And so the model is a cohort-based mentoring model that takes a small cohort of students in 7th grade and follows them until they graduate. And during those 6 years, They have the opportunity for college career readiness, experiential, outdoor, and travel-based opportunities, being mentored, having the opportunity to become a peer mentor and build leadership skills,
Yeah.
have the opportunity for social emotional development, and be exposed to different people, places, cultures, landscapes that exist outside of their rural community, not only as a way to help them have a better perspective of what's out there, but also to allow them to appreciate the very community that they're growing up in that they have no perspective on because they haven't had the contrast of other novel experiences to allow them to see it.
Now, what you just described, often we'll hear about, city kids, urban kids escaping to the wild for the summer you're focusing on kids who are already living in a rural setting. Why that focus on kids in rural settings in outdoor activities?
Yeah, well, the outdoor activities is really just our hook to be able to build that relationship. And what a hook we have here in Maine.
Right.
But, the fact is that young people growing up in rural communities, 42% of 18 to 24-year-olds nationally are currently enrolled in 2 or 4 year colleges, universities.
Okay.
But out of that 42%, only 29% are young people growing up in rural spaces.
Wow.
And so what we're trying to do is help overcome the aspirations gap in rural communities by not only exposing them to all the opportunities outside of their focus of their everyday lives, but also this idea of really helping them become connected to whatever that spark is inside of them.
Gotcha. And so now things have evolved to include the Rural Futures Fund. Can you describe how that came about? I've read about the learners and their interest in this. How the Rural Futures Fund come about and what does that mean now? What's the purpose, the mission?
Yeah, so after 18 years of running Trekkers, I had given my notice because I was itching to have a broader impact on the state. The Rural Futures Fund was at an inflection point in their own evolution as a foundation and wanted to move away from transactional grant making to a more relationship-centered approach and really focus on one project and to see if they could move the needle on it. And in this case, they decided that they were going to go all in on youth development to help raise aspirations.
Yep.
But they had a really clear topic area that they wanted to address. In their research, they realized that for kids growing up in small rural communities, that where aspirational foreclosure would begin to happen would be during the 8-9 transition.
Yep.
Because they're growing up in these pre-K through 8 community schools in their own community where every adult could name, know, and nourish the spark inside those young people.
Yeah.
But none of those relationships would go with them into the regional high school outside of their community.
Yep.
And students who could name it and have folks nourishing that spark would no longer have it. So they said, what if we could find a model that we could invest in that really addresses that 8-9 transition? So they did a landscape scan of what was happening in Maine around youth development in rural spaces. And they came across Trekkers and they asked me whether or not I would come and help them come up with a strategy to create a grant-making initiative that could help rural communities address this issue.
Gotcha.
And that became what we call the Aspirations Incubator.
Did they do that with you in mind, or, knowing your background and your talents and your interest, or did they have this idea and then they found you? How did that match happen?
Yeah, I think they had the idea of addressing the 8-9 transition challenge, but I don't think they had me in mind. I think ultimately they did their landscape scan and asked me to come and do a dog and pony show in front of their board.
Yeah.
And based on everything else they were hearing, they got so fired up and said, listen, will you come with us? And I said, well, I will, under one condition, that we don't try to spread the Trekkers model across the state, but instead that we distill the practice of Trekkers into the underlying programming principles and allow communities based on their own uniqueness, as well as whatever youth serving organization is already there, to apply those principles and see what they come up with, almost like open source.
Yeah.
And let's see what they create.
Yeah.
And they said, that sounds wonderful. Let's figure it out.
We talk a lot these days about political polarization. And as we learn more about this subject in the United States, it does seem clear that one classification that demonstrates diverging points of view is urban versus rural. It's also increasingly clear that kids in less affluent, more rural settings do not have the same access to after-school enrichment programs as do kids in more resource-rich urban and suburban locations. Don Carpenter's work aims to close these differences and has focused in part on what he describes as an aspirations gap. Rural communities are underrepresented in colleges, he says, and the programs he's created and led are aimed to connect kids with the spark within them. To this end, he began work on the Aspirations Incubator. Somewhere along the line, you come up with the idea of the Aspirations Incubator. Can you describe that? And I think it was designed to be a 6-year program. And where are you in that, and how's it all worked out?
Yeah, so what we did was we had to recruit various demonstration sites to take the 11 youth programming principles and create something. And so I spent about 1.5 years doing my own landscape scan, what I called a listening tour, and just wanted to hear what was happening around middle school and high school students in rural communities based on, from a youth development perspective, whether it was in the schools or outside of the schools. And so after that 1.5 years, I brought the board 10 organizations that I thought we could pilot this with. And they were going to pick 4, but they ended up picking 8. And the idea was that we would create our own cohort and follow that cohort for 6 years as a way to model this.
Yep.
What they were about to do with their own small cohorts.
Okay.
And we would provide a major grant each of the 6 years. We'd provide technical assistance, coaching, whatever they needed as an organization and or at a program level over those 6 years, and see what the outcomes would be. And we hired the University of Southern Maine's organization called the Data Innovation Project to help build the evaluation model around the 6-year pilot. Then we just took off and went from there.
So where are you now? Well, first 6 years, I'm assuming. Do you start with 7th graders?
So the idea was that we would, let me back up. Once we selected the 8 sites, we provided them immediate funding to hire somebody to help implement this program design.
Okay.
We then had those 8 folks from around the state come and live in a house. This is prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, right.
And get trained for 12 weeks in these principles.
12 weeks.
And they live together.
Wow.
And each week during that summer of 2016, we would train them on one of the principles. And at the end of the 12 weeks, they went back to their home sites and they took what they learned and decided to come up with a conceptual framework for what this 6-year model could look like for their community and organization. And then we began to take from there, and we ended with 5 sites. We had 3 drop out over the course of those 3 years. And we learned a lot from that in terms of a site readiness perspective. But I'm happy to say that the original 5 sites, now that we're through the pilot, which ended at the 22-23 school year,
yep,
are now freestanding. We're providing a very small grant, but still providing a lot of technical assistance and coaching. But they're all built within the annual budgets of those organizations.
Amazing. So a few thoughts or questions. When you brought those 8 organizations to your board, can you describe what kind of organizations are these? Are these boys and girls clubs or Ys or these, after school? What are these organizations?
Yeah, great question. They are, or they were, YMCA. There was a YMCA.
Okay.
There were a couple community-based nonprofit youth-serving organizations. There were some summer camp programming that were doing kind of shoulder season and year-round programming, but their main piece of existence was summer camps.
Yep.
But some of them were environmental education organizations. Some of them were, we tapped into the 4-H, main 4-H network.
Yep.
So there was a 4-H organization that took it on. So there was just a wide variety. The challenge that we have, especially in the pilot and now as we move forward, which I can talk more about, is that each of these organizations, in order to be a part of the Aspirations Incubator, had to build a partnership with the local school district.
Yeah.
Because what we believe is that in a rural community, a youth-serving organization cannot work in isolation from the largest youth development organization in any given rural community, which is this community school that's right in their backyard. So that was a mandate that we provided. So that was probably one of the only prescriptive deal breakers. If they weren't willing to build a relationship with the school district, that would kind of eliminate them from this. But we didn't want to fund the school district.
Right.
Like a school district, if they came to us and said, hey, we really want to be a part of this, would you be willing? And at the time we said no, because of all the leadership changes that happened within a school district over 6 years.
Yeah, right.
And we didn't want to do this deep dive of investment and then find out the new superintendent didn't want this to happen.
Right.
So we had to find a freestanding youth-serving entity of some sort within every given rural community. But that eliminates a lot of rural communities because a lot of them don't have something of that type of entity in their community.
Gotcha. You've shown, it seems to me, as you've built this, you've shown incredible patience. There aren't many, it's essentially a startup when you get the money and to say, we're going to do a 6-year, 6 months is a long time for a lot of entrepreneurs and startups. So 6 years, huge patience. And you're clearly a results, prove it kind of person. What kind of results were you looking for? What kind of things were you going to measure? And how did things work out?
Yeah. So we were looking at a couple different measuring points from the trying to better understand whether or not a young person feels like they matter, that they belong to any given community.
Yeah.
We were trying to track social emotional development, things like optimism,
Yeah.
pieces around empathy, agency, pieces around perseverance, relationships with adults, relationships with peers, whether or not they felt safe in school, whether they felt like they fit into school culture. We looked at critical thinking. We looked at a lot of different measures of social emotional development. And we also looked at attendance, chronically absenteeism.
Yeah, right.
We looked at math and English grades. And then ultimately, we wanted to look at whether or not they went on to some kind of post-secondary aspiration, specifically around 2 and 4 year universities.
And did you measure a couple times a year, every year? How often would you check your progress?
Yeah, so it was a beautiful, comprehensive approach. There were assessments that we did with young people around self-chain. We did that happened every year. We did focus groups every other year. And that focus group could be students, it could be parents, it could be administrators at schools, the program managers in each of the sites, it could be board members. It was getting data from school districts around what was happening within the district. We looked at data around each year. I'm sorry, in 8th, 10th, and 12th, that same cohort would take various surveys around their own aspirations and what they were thinking about over time. And so it was pretty comprehensive.
At this point in our conversation, a couple of things struck me about the type of entrepreneur that Don Carpenter is. First off, he's not someone who feels he needs to do everything by himself or to always start something new, but rather is open to partnering with existing organizations like school systems, YMCAs, or Boys and Girls Clubs, if these might help him achieve his goals. He's also remarkably patient. It'd be hard for many entrepreneurs to say, okay, we're going to kick this off with a 6-year program, the results of which we'll measure and assess before we think about building or growing any of this. This is not typical for many in today's move fast and break things startup culture. And it was interesting to hear the types of things measured when assessing the impact of Don's work, asking if kids felt they mattered, belonged, and music to our ears, were they optimistic? Getting back to our conversation, I asked Don to talk about what the research showed about the results of his efforts.
Let me first start with some things that didn't work.
Okay.
What we recognized in terms of probably the biggest thing that happened to us in terms of losing the 3 sites was from a site readiness perspective. 2 of the sites were going through founder leadership changes at an organizational level.
Yeah.
And we took the risk of building a partnership with those organizations. And it just proved to be too much change.
Yeah.
Not because you have to understand that these organizations had been in existence doing certain amount of programming for kids over a course of time.
Yeah.
Really focused in the middle school space.
Yep.
Or late elementary space.
Yep.
Which if you looked at youth development organizations across the country, Maine or otherwise, you would find that there are people knocking it out of the park in late elementary, after school programming, and middle school space.
Okay.
But when they make that 8-9 transition, these programs, their numbers fall incredibly.
Yeah.
And so what we were looking for in my listening tour was whether or not they had interest in supporting those kids as they move through the 8-9 transition and wanted to work with teenagers. And so we felt like we found them, but it was going to be mission shift away from just working with middle school space to moving into the high school space, which is a different approach.
Right.
So when you add in the founder-led organization going through their own transitions on top of this mission shift, it just proved to be too much. But we learned a lot from it. And in the spirit of the incubator, we saw failure as an opportunity to learn from.
Okay.
When we looked at the results, the thing that I'm probably most proud of, I'll give you a stat through the main integrated health use survey that happens every 2 years in Maine.
Yep.
And if you looked at both middle school and high school, I think it's middle school is 49% and high school is 51% of students feel like they matter. Only 49 and 51%.
Wow.
In their community. And our results came back for that first cohort as they moved through the 6-year model at 93%.
My goodness.
And we feel at the heart of this entire model is that having a sense of belonging is the precursor for all optimism, for all ambition.
Totally.
Because what you have to have at the heart of it is that a young person feels like they belong and that they matter. Then when that is there and that ingredient is fully within their cellular makeup, their ability to think about the future and think about what they want to do in their lives is so much greater than when you are in a situation where a young person doesn't feel that way. And so from that perspective, we just felt like we hit the lottery in terms of what they were saying. And keep in mind, we kicked this 6-year pilot off in the 2016-17 school year. Well, we all know what happened. So 2.5 years of the 6-year pilot, we had organizations not being able to do all the experiential pieces of this model. Doesn't mean that the relational aspects weren't there, but it was very much modified. And so to have that type of result at the end, well, we were really, really excited about. Another piece was that in that first cohort, we had 94% of those students at the end of their high school experience going to some form of 2 or 4-year university.
What is the average in a rural Maine high school? Yeah,
so the last stat we have on that is, I think, the 21-22 school year, and it's down to around 57. Historically, it's been about 60% in the state of Maine.
Yeah.
Now, nationally, there's a concept that's very well known in these circles about summer melt.
Yes.
And so the summer melt is about 15% nationally. And so from the time they graduate from somebody who's got into a school, and by the time they enter September of that year, they don't end up going.
Yeah.
And so from that perspective, we experienced that same thing, but we had about 78% end up going from that. Now that's a place within the incubator that we were able to track and be able to begin to have conversations with the network.
Yep.
To begin to think about how do we address that summer melt come the second cohort. Because keep in mind that in 2016-17, they recruited the first cohort.
Yeah.
When they got into the 8th grade, they recruited a cohort behind them. And 6 years later, there were 6 cohorts.
Okay.
And so we've been able to look at the data over time now and be able to use what we're learning as a way to build training into the incubator as a way to help them be empowered to kind of overcome some of the obstacles that were showing up in the data.
So when you started this out, how would you describe these results? Did they exceed your expectations? Were you confident the whole time? Were there times you thought, especially I would think during the pandemic, oh my gosh, how do you feel about these results and what does that mean for you all going forward?
Well, as somebody who built the model while building an organization.
Yeah.
And knowing I built an organization that was singularly focused on this model and nothing else.
Right.
The 8 organizations that we took on had an ecosystem of programs, and this was kind of a unicorn within their mission.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So the fact that these results, and then add in the pandemic,
right?
The fact that we got these results, I couldn't be happier about.
Yeah, I bet.
And I have to say, the parts that we didn't see happening when we created the Aspirations Incubator from a funder perspective, we knew that we would be supporting young people, the program managers who were supporting the young people over the course of the 6 years. What we didn't realize was how much we would be supporting the executive leadership of the organizations over those 6 years.
Interesting.
Because as we all know, that what happened was when the pandemic hit, it didn't just hit families. It didn't just hit the program staff. It didn't just hit the young people, but it hit these organizations like crazy.
Sure.
So what we realized was, in order for a young person to have the opportunity to thrive through the intervention of this model, that 2 things had to be happening simultaneously. The program managers had to be thriving in their own lives.
Yeah.
And the organization had to be thriving as well.
Right.
And so if the organization's hitting the financial speed bump or some major piece is happening, that would impact the program staff, which would impact the students. So we had to kind of build our own muscle to say, hey, we'll help with you to think through development plans, through PR and communication strategies, to help with board development. You name it, we were in meetings, kind of different ways, providing a thought partner for them.
I loved hearing Don talk about his results. Did you notice that when I asked him about these, he started by telling me what didn't work? As I've said before on this show, being optimistic doesn't mean you're starry-eyed or unrealistic. And this is reinforced by hearing Don say that not everything they tried was a success. That said, some of his successes were truly inspiring, like 93% of kids in his program saying they feel like they matter, a number that's nearly double that of the rest of their peer group. And I also appreciated Don saying that having a sense of belonging is a precursor for all optimism and ambition. Given the timing and nature of Don's work, inevitably it was impacted by the pandemic, and I wanted him to speak some more about that here. Hey, you've mentioned the pandemic a few times, and I was thinking those statistics on the sense of belonging that the kids were showing going through this program were stunning. And I imagine, in a funny way, you gave them a real gift by starting this before the pandemic, because I bet that sense of belonging was huge during those 2.5 years, right? I mean, a lot of kids who already felt a little lost, then go into isolation and feel increasingly lost. It was probably, in hindsight, you wouldn't have known this when you kicked it off, but it was a great gift to those kids probably to have a couple of years under their belt in this program.
Yeah. I mean, comparative to young people who didn't have this type of support system.
Yeah.
Because what happened was our program managers went right into a strategy of doing their own gaps analysis of who was suffering from those families for basic needs.
Yeah.
And they were able to provide food. They were provide support in terms of people who might get evicted and then have to move out of the district.
Sure.
They were providing so many different services that they never thought that they would offer based on this approach. When there were kids whose birthday happened during the pandemic, they would go and decorate their front yards with signs and things of that nature. So when they woke up, they would see it.
Huge.
I think one thing to keep in mind, Bill, that if you looked at schools and you looked at youth serving organizations that don't take on this type of model, and I'll explain the differentiation, but when that many, probably 90% or more, when it comes to youth serving organizations or schools, they only work with kids when they show up in their space.
Right.
So when the pandemic happened,
terrible.
They had no idea how to communicate with families or those kids if they weren't showing up on their Zoom calls.
Terrible.
Which many of them didn't.
Yep.
So one of the fundamental ingredients of this model is that the program manager who has their finger on the pulse of their cohort for 6 years has the opportunity to spend time with young people when they're not in the program.
Right.
So they can pick them up from school. They can be in their social media. They can be on their text.
Yep.
And so from that perspective, it breaks down these walls that were major barriers for schools and other youth serving organizations who had policies in place to say, you can't have a connection with that young person when they're not here.
Yeah. Right.
And that was a prerequisite of ours. We said we can build healthy policy protocols and procedures for your program staff to be able to have a relationship with one of the young people outside of the four walls of this program. And you have to trust us that we can do this because we've got enough years. Freckles just turned 30 this year. And so we can do it. And we'll work with you. It may not be perfectly designed around the policy of Trekkers, but we'll work with you. And so when that happened, our folks didn't miss a beat. They could show up in front yards and they could go walk around the block with kids. They could do a number of things that schools and other youth serving organizations just couldn't.
So Don, what happens now? So you've built this model, you've proven it. You've got cohort after cohort. Is it now up and running to a point that you're satisfied? Are you looking to add organizations? And I'm assuming people are going to listen to this who don't live in Maine, who think, gosh, this would be great in my state. Are you evangelizing? Tell me where you go from here.
Well, I'm really excited about where we're going to go from here. So the Rural Futures Fund had about $10 million left in its endowment when I came on board.
Okay.
The idea was we were going to spend it all on this bet.
Yeah.
That we could raise aspirations for young people in rural communities through our investment. And if we did, we would attract other people, both in the state and nationally, that would want to take this on.
Yeah.
So we kind of went in faith that there would be a there.
Yep.
But at the same time, we didn't want to get too far ahead of our skis in case it didn't work.
Sure.
And start building out a new organization or trying to figure this out now. So what we've done is we waited, as you said earlier. We've just been really patient with this process.
Yeah.
Lots of communication with our 5 partners, asking them what they want, what they need, but also waiting for the data to come back. And once we were satisfied that this actually worked, I knew it anecdotally. I know it in my soul. I know it from the 24 weddings that I've officiated of alumni who've graduated through the 6 year. I know that lives have been changed by this, but we needed the scientific proof that it works, the evidence.
Right. Sure.
So what we did was we decided that as the Rural Future Fund comes to an end at the end of 2025,
okay,
we would create and launch a new organization that would take its place. And that organization is called the Rural Youth Institute. And what the Rural Youth Institute is going to do, it's going to be a think and do tank around evidence-based practices to promote youth development in rural spaces.
Wow.
It's going to have 4 major pillars. It's going to have an immersive learning lab, which will be the new home of the Aspirations Incubator. So we will bring in new sites who want to learn this model and want to be part of the network going forward.
Okay.
It will have an advocacy arm. It will have a research arm to continue to do evidence-based research that will then inform the last pillar, which is training. And these 4 pillars will act as feedback loops on one another to strengthen the overall mission. So the idea is we're going to expand and bring in new sites. I'm happy to report that we've got 3 new sites moving into this fall. So if you include trekkers, we've got 9 organizations using this model across the state right now. And the idea moving forward is that we'll continue to iterate on that. And we're building research practice partnerships with the University of Maine and a number of their faculty who are doing research on rural topics, especially around youth. And we're building out various training pillars and modules. And so we're really, really excited about it. And we're still building it out, but it'll be fully up and running by the end of our FF coming to an end.
Incredible. And are you open to out-of-state, non-Maine people, or would you think about that? If you got a call after this interview and someone said, "Oh, I want to do this in Oregon, or I want to do this in Iowa, or I want to do this in New Hampshire," I'm sure you're busy enough as it is, but.
Well, no, we intentionally didn't call it the Maine Rural Youth Institute.
Great.
Because we really do feel like other rural states who are wanting to go and focus on depth and duration when it comes to young people, that we should be able to support them in doing that through the evidence that we've collected over the course of the last 7.5 years.
Amazing.
We're really focused on trying to put a life on a life of the young people for 6 years.
Incredible. Yeah. And I think your emphasis and you're very consistent about focusing on rural communities. And it seems to me, we talk a lot about the division in this country, and it's often red state, blue state. But as I'm sure you're aware, if you look at the data, often it's rural, urban is really where the divisions come from. And so many of the resources, so much of the attention, so much of the media is located more in the urban settings that rural settings get left behind. And increasingly, rural economies are challenged too. So it seems like you're really doing important work, and your focus on rural versus urban is super helpful.
Well, just think about it this way. Many of the rural communities in Maine suffer from the brain drain for kids who don't need a program like this, who are going to go off to college with or without this intervention. many times can't find employment in their own communities or didn't feel a sense of connection to those communities.
Yeah.
And thus take their talent elsewhere. Now you have students growing up feeling like they really belong in their community and going to 2 and 4 year school with the hope that they could come back or want to come back and try to figure it out. There's a lot of work that is above my pay grade around economic development in these communities.
Yeah.
But we're doing our part to try to figure out pathways for them to get trained and educated in the things that they're passionate about, to bring those skills, talents, and sparks back to their community so that they can then inspire the next generation.
Wow. Well, you are inspiring me and everyone listening to this, I'm sure. A lot of us, at the end of the day, you wonder if the work you're doing matters. And I can only imagine how great this all makes you feel. And if nothing else than presiding over 24 weddings of alums in your organization, if that doesn't make you feel good, I don't know what would. So I can't thank you enough for the work you're doing, Don. You're a real inspiration. And thanks for taking the time to do this show. It's been an incredible pleasure.
Hey, thanks a lot, Bill. I really appreciate it. And I'm just so glad that you're focused on optimism because we need more of it right now.
Thanks so much. Take care, Don.
Okay, be well.
I find all of Don's work to be inspiring, but none more so than how he and his team met the challenges presented by the pandemic. Before COVID lockdowns, they did their work at places the kids came to. Then overnight, they had to rethink their work and go out to the kids, supporting them through birthdays and maintaining their sense of belonging in a time when so many of us felt great separation. Looking ahead, Don paints an optimistic picture of what will come next with the Rural Youth Institute, which he describes as a think and do tank, and hopes will attract people not just in Maine, but in rural settings around the country. And of all the amazing results Don's work has led to, no statistic struck me more than when he said he's officiated 24 weddings of young people who went through his program. That is incredible and inspiring. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Don Carpenter. Before you go, please consider leaving us a rating or review. Subscribe to this podcast and check out the Optimism Institute on social media. My special thanks go out to the team at Sound On Studios for their incredible help with editing and mixing this and all of our Blue Sky episodes. You can learn more about their work at soundonstudios.com. All graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. And that's Crush with a K if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work online. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and the host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.